Now, U.S. President Joe Biden has hit the ground running after a tumultuous run-up to his eventual inauguration on January 20th. He has much on his plate domestically, from COVID-19 to domestic terrorist groups. However, many around the world are keen to see what he is going to do in places such as the Middle East and, of course, Africa, to take a look at what the Biden administration holds in store for our continent and the Middle East. I'm joined by Ambassador Barry Gilder. He's our man in Damascus, as well as Middle East specialist Shannon Ibrahim. Thank you so very much for joining me. Ambassador, thank you for your time. Let me start with you. What is the situation in Syria at the moment? I mean, we had a huge humanitarian crisis, sanctions, and its ability or the impact of its ability to deal with, things like the global crisis and so on is obviously a very real reality. Do you think that from where you're sitting, that the Syrian administration welcomes this move away from Trump? Do you think Biden is going to have a different position, considering that he was very much part of the Obama administration, and many of the people in his current administration are, in fact, people of that era? Do you think change is going to happen, or do you think it's going to be more of the same?
Hi, Karina. Thanks for inviting me. I'm wondering whether you haven't just answered your own question. But briefly on your opening question, the situation in Syria, to sum up as quickly as I can, in most of the country that is now under government control, the situation is peaceful. The government is working hard to rebuild and reconstruct. In the northwest and northeast of Syria, there's still an ongoing conflict, although there has been a ceasefire. There are still many skirmishes. There's the Turkish occupation of parts of the north of Syria, northeast. There's the presence of American troops. And then, of course, the Kurdish forces in northeast Syria, which are controlling part of that territory. So you see a lot of military skirmishes going on in that part of the country. You even see terrorist groups fighting each other. It's a very confusing situation. But in most of the rest of Syria, apart from some small incidents of terrorism in the south, Syria is relatively peaceful in those areas controlled by the government. Of course, we have what seem to be increasingly frequent incursions by Israel, bombing targets in Syria, in and around Damascus and other parts of the country. The irony is the Israelis claim that they are targeting the Iranian forces that are supporting the Syrian government, but those Iranian forces are supporting the Syrian government's fight against ISIS, particularly in the eastern deserts of Syria, and Israel is bombing the Iranians who are fighting ISIS. So we have a very confusing situation. In relation to the main part of your question, which you partly answered yourself,
well, that's my view. I want to hear your view.
No, sure. Although there might be some positive changes in some respects, for example, if the Biden administration reopens the agreement with Iran and the tension between the states, the United States and Iran is somewhat lessened, and they go back to that original JCPOA agreement, that might relieve some of the tensions in the region. But quite honestly, my own assessment is that the approach of the U.S. To the region, to the Middle East region, is really centered around their support to Israel. And their attempts to achieve regime change in Syria, in Iraq, and other parts of the region are really centered on supporting their Israeli friends. And as you yourself noted, Biden was vice president to Obama, and his nominee for Secretary of State were all involved in the original invasion of Syria. So in general, U.S. administrations even going back to the Bush days, have made a hell of a mess in the region. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and in Syria. So I don't hold out much hope that this administration would be any different. And some people, some analysts are thinking it might be even worse.
Now, let me bring Shannon in quickly. Shannon, to just kind of bring it back to Africa. I mean, Ambassador Gilder mentioned an important question here about, you know, the fact that for many it's confusing about all the terrorist activity in Syria. A lot of people are not aware that the Syrians actually are in a pitched battle against ISIS. And ISIS is supposed to be the main kind of threat, if you like, of, you know, to the US. We see insurgency on the African continent by Al-Shabaab. We see it in Mozambique, for example. What is it that we can learn from the Syrians and from even Iran, because they too were involved in fighting ISIS, when we look at growing, you know, ISIS activity in places like Mozambique and like Nigeria? And can we count on the US to join us in that, or will their Middle Eastern politics impact the way we deal with what is clearly a growing terrorist threat here on the African continent?
Thanks for having me, Karima. I think we need to learn the lessons for Southern Africa, particularly what happened with Boko Haram in Nigeria. It wasn't dealt with immediately in that situation, and I think we've learned that this is a very clear and present danger, as it was in Nigeria. And the longer it simmers, the more it expands its territory, and it becomes has more weapons and money. So in terms of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, I think the Americans have been quite open to assisting South Africa and the region in dealing, and Mozambique, obviously, with the Cabo Delgado problem. And I think that should be a big priority for the region, to try and make sure that what happened in terms of the expansion of Cabo Delgado and of ISIS in Syria is not replicated in our own region.
If you look, Ambassador Gilder, at the strategies the Syrians deployed against ISIS, I mean, you are government's person in Damascus. If you were to advise Minister Naledi Pandor on what it is that we can do to support our neighbor in Mozambique, against what is happening in some of the northern provinces, what are the most useful things that you've been able to pick up since you're there that will stand Southern Africa and SADC, for example, in good stead to push back insurgency activity?
It's very difficult for me to answer that question, Karima, because the situation in Syria is very different and in some ways more complex, because apart from ISIS, you had for Al-Qaeda groups or groups that developed from Al-Qaeda, you have what the West likes to call the moderate opposition, who armed opposition and killing lots of people. You have a whole range of groups, and for example, one of the things with the help of Russia that Syria has done in some parts of the country is that they have created peace by negotiating with the armed groups, whether terrorist or other groups, in parts of the country, and reintegrated those of them who wanted to be reintegrated, and those who didn't were moved up north to around the area of Idlib in northwest Syria. So there's a very different approach, and I'm not sure how much that would be applicable to a situation in Mozambique, although there are lessons that can be learned. But with ISIS, I'm not sure how negotiable, if there's such a word, ISIS is.
Yeah.
They were defeated not defeated completely, but largely defeated in Syria militarily, but that's because they, for some time, occupied large territories and declared a caliphate. And so it was more of a conventional war of reclaiming or recapturing those territories.
Okay. Shannon, let me bring you in, the big question in many people's minds is global governance and whether a U.S. presidency with Biden at the head is going to, continue with the unilateral approach that the U.S. has historically had. I mean, former President Trump had a very isolationist policy, but he also, his first overseas visit that he made was in fact to Saudi Arabia to almost rearrange the deck chairs, if you like, with devastating consequences again on the African continent in Yemen. So what is your expectations of a Biden administration for Afro-Middle East relations, and what kind of scope will there be for innovative new ways of dealing with conflicts that seem to be intractable? And of course, African countries and particularly institutions like the AU would be keen to not replicate what we see in parts of the Middle East, given the way that insurgents seem to have now gotten a foothold in a place like Mozambique.
Well, Karima, I think that the new Biden administration definitely has signaled that it's moving back towards multilateralism and is ready to re-engage with the world. Clearly, Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, would like to see the U.S. playing a leadership role. They say that they want to lead by their own example. They want to restore global relations and their historic traditional alliances. So we've seen they've already taken very quick action in the last week to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Accord. They're going to rejoin the WHO. They may even take different positions within the WTO. For example, the Nigerian candidate for the head of the WTO, the only country who was blocking that person from taking over is the US, and we may see a different position on that. In general, I think we'll see a lot more collaborative positioning, less aggressive rhetoric, and they'll probably try to reduce trade tensions as well. I think in terms of Africa, we'll see a much more positive relationship, one more based on assistance and mutual respect. There may be some assistance in terms of COVID supplies. I think all of that would be positive. But we mustn't also forget that probably about 80% of the focus of the new Biden administration will be on local issues, given the political and racial polarization in the United States, as well as the real tragedy of COVID and needing to turn it around. And also the economic situation in the U.S. will really take up a lot of their time. But in terms of Africa, the new Biden administration has signaled that it would like to have stronger relations with the African Union, which is very positive, certainly wanting to show goodwill towards the continent. And one of the first things that were done is lifting the so-called Muslim ban, which had affected many African countries with Muslim majorities. And I think that was really welcomed by those countries. And I think more and more we'll see the U.S. offering assistance over time with peace and security issues, working with the AU and dealing with counterterrorism. So I think all of those things are really important. And I think what's also interesting, you mentioned about Yemen. Antony Blinken said, I think on his first day in his role, is that ending the war in Yemen was going to be one of his priorities as Secretary of State. And as you know, in the final hours of the Trump administration, Trump had designated the Houthis in Yemen as a terrorist organization, making it very difficult to deliver humanitarian aid and food to the millions of starving people. And I think that they will make a big effort now. And all of these shifts will really change the dynamics in terms of the Middle East, because don't forget, the U.S. Congress had a bipartisan vote against the U.S. continuing to support the war in Yemen. And I think this will make quite a big difference in terms of the dynamics.
Absolutely. Ambassador Gilder, final question to you. There are sanctions against Syria. We spoke about, Shannon outlined some of the return to multilateralism that will happen under Biden. Do you think that will, go for countries like Syria as well, particularly given the COVID crisis and, of course, the struggle to access the vaccine? Syrian oil, for example, is confiscated. Their monies are frozen in banks. How do you expect the Biden administration to deal with, the Bashar regime?
Karima, I honestly don't hold out much hope on that score. There's the sanctions. You asked right at the beginning about the humanitarian situation in Syria. The sanctions, which are supposed to be targeted against the government, are actually impacting terribly on ordinary people. And in fact, are having the effect of ordinary people being more supportive of their government because they blame the United States and the European Union for their suffering. I don't see the U.S. strategy on Syria changing dramatically. The thing about Trump, he was all over the place. He kept changing his mind and wasn't really sure how to handle Syria. He pulled out his troops and was pressured to put them back again and so on. I anticipate a more constant or consistent approach from the Biden administration, and I suspect that their sanctions are not going to be relaxed or lifted in spite of calls from the UN Security Secretary General rather and others and ourselves, the South African government, to at least ease or lift those sanctions because of COVID in particular. So it's a wait-and-see situation, but I don't hold out much hope.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Ambassador, was that you think the situation might get worse. And of course, the elephant in the room is often Iran. We saw the negotiations with Iran go completely pear-shaped under Trump. What do you think is on the horizon there? And given Iran's dominance in the region, this will obviously impact Syria. Do you think Biden is going to have a more hawkish approach even? Or do you think that everyone's going to be dragged back to the table and you know, talks will start afresh?
I would just correct one thing. I think the elephant in the room is actually Turkey, but we might not have time to talk about that now. But it's all going to depend on Biden's relationship with Israel, as I said earlier. It all centers around Israel. Israel sees Iran as its enemy number one, and Israel would be very unhappy if the Biden administration improved its relationship with Iran. So it's all going to center on that. I hesitate to try and predict anything, but
okay.
I did say
Ambassador, we're out of time, and of course that is a conversation that is requiring an entire show on its own, just, you know, what the Biden administration's approach is going to be toward Israel, something that was, of course, rearranged under the Trump administration. That was our South African ambassador in Barry Gilder, and he's, of course, representing us in Syria, as well as Shannon Ibrahim, a Middle East specialist. Still ahead, how is the African National Congress navigating the country while the COVID-19 crisis continues? Don't go anywhere.